Hey guys, it's Max. Welcome to my easy step-by-step build guide on the most powerful computer that I have ever put together. Some of these parts are very expensive, while others are fairly inexpensive, and I'm going to have a list of all of them in the video description below. Some of these parts I already owned and I wouldn't recommend them because maybe it just costs a little bit too much money, or maybe on some of them I skipped some money. So I actually have a list of the parts right next to it that I would recommend if you're going to do this build. So definitely go and check them out. I'm going to cover some of them right here before we get into the actual build guide. And I also want to let you know, if you're watching this video, I have a video on all the performance aspect of this system with it all being put together. And you can see how it performs and how it compares to some other computers. So definitely go and check that out. I'll leave a card right over here, and there's going to be a link in the video description. So in front of me, I have this brand new Threadripper CPU, 32 cores, 64 threads. That is insane. And with this liquid cooling system right here, it is going to be nice and cool, even if we overclock it a bit, which we will do. Here we have our motherboard, and our graphics card is the NVIDIA 1080 Ti, which is the current best bang for the buck graphics card for a high-end PC like this. Now, if you are from the future and you have a 2080 Ti graphics card, I am planning to do a comparison between this one and that graphics card once it comes out. I still have a good while to wait before I get that in because it's not released yet. But make sure you guys are subscribed and you guys enable notifications because that's going to be a great shootout, and I'm interested how much faster that is, or if we get any improvement compared to this one, which you could probably buy used for a much lower price. Moving on, we have 64 gigabytes of RAM. I have my NVMe M.2 SSD, thermal solution, my power supply, which this is a little bit overkill. It's really nice, but it's pricey. I just already had this. And the case, not a very expensive case, but I really like the cases that NZXT make, if that's the way you pronounce it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to take all these parts out of the boxes because you guys could probably do that yourself, and we'll start the build. So we're going to start off by getting your case out of the box, and then we're going to take off both side panels. Now on the inside, there's going to be a white box that has all your screws and different hardware. It's actually zip tied to the drive sled. Now you want to grab your motherboard box, and I already took my motherboard out, but inside we have some accessories and extras, and we want to take out our back plate. This is going to go on the case. The back plate is going to pop in right in this opening, and it's kind of has a built-in spring where the metal was bent, and I'm glad this case has an opening from the back side, makes it nice and easy to use. Now I'm just going to place the case on the back side here and get out my motherboard. I like to set it down on top of the box that it came with, that way I don't mess up any of the pins on the back. And you do want to touch something that's metallic to get rid of any static electricity. Now inside of the case, we have these things called standoffs. They're little, looks like kind of bolts that are threaded. That's what our motherboard is going to connect and screw into. So if you're using the same case and motherboard as I'm using, the only place you're going to need to add one of these motherboard standoffs is right over here in the middle of the PCI slot covers. Everywhere else lines up perfectly, which is really nice. So we're going to get out our little box that has hardware in it. And actually we just have one labeled standoff. It looks like it was the only one that's missing, and we will add that. I'm just going to use a little standoff tool and then just tighten it down. Our case is now ready to install the motherboard, but I prefer to install as much components externally as I can. So I have our M.2 SSD, and inside of the motherboard there's these little baggies with just a single screw inside, and that's what's going to hold us down. And then here on the motherboard we have two locations. You can choose which one you're going to use, and this really only goes in one way. If it's not going in, you have it the wrong way. Tighten it down. It doesn't need to be too tight, just until it stops. Now onto the CPU. I'm going to take out the included wrench here and unscrew this top bolt. I like that it's locked in there. We're going to push in on these little tabs here, and it's going to open up. And then you want to slide out the little plastic piece to get it out of the way. You want to be careful and not touch the surface of the CPU to not get any oils on there. This piece just slides right out. And just like we took out that little plastic piece, we're going to slide this one in and push it down. Now we can take the cradle, also push it down, and reverse and screw this in. And this little wrench is cool because it's like a torque wrench. As soon as you go tight enough, it's actually going to stop spinning. You'll hear a little click. So we tighten down that piece. Now we're going to tighten down the one labeled 2. and the third one. Out of your case hardware box, you want to get out the screws that are labeled M3 5 flat. This is what we're going to use to install the motherboard into the case. And you can grab the motherboard, just be very careful what you're doing, take it slow. I like to get one hand over here where our cover is, if it works. You can kind of look over on this side, make sure everything's aligned properly. And this case is really nice, it's really easy to build with. And right over here we have a little pin. So the motherboard's going to sit down, it's going to get aligned properly. And that might have been the easiest time I've ever had aligning a motherboard into a case. So we have a screw here, here, 1, 2, 3 over here, one over here, and right here. One word of advice is use a screwdriver that's magnetic, just in case one of these falls down, so you can get it out without removing the whole motherboard. Now we're going to install the power supply. Inside our hardware box for the case, there's 4 screws labeled 6-32 hexagon. That's what we're going to use. And with this case, there's actually a little mount that is removable with some thumb screws. So this kind of makes it a little bit easier. So you can remove this, tighten it down to the power supply. The power supply that I'm using has removable cables. It's completely modular, but I like to still plug in the cables, at least the main ones, before I slide it in. I feel like it's a little bit easier. So I have my 24 pin for the motherboard. I have an 8 pin, which is for graphics cards, and these are labeled. And then I have 2 8 pins that are labeled CPU. One of them we're going to use the full 8 output, and the other one we're going to split off in half like this, and that's going to feed the motherboard as well. Now I'm going to carefully feed the cables into here. Take my time, pull them back out of the side, and slide in the power supply, and then just use the thumb screws to screw it in. We're going to do our best keeping these cables organized, so there's little pass-throughs here with little rubber grommets. We're going to take our 24 pin, and that one's going to go in here right in the middle. I'm just going to push it in just a little bit. Then we're going to take one of these CPU connections. I'm going to take one that's already split in half. That one is going to go right up here. Just leave it dangling. And then the other one is going to go right up top over here. And the one that we have for the graphics card, I'm just going to leave it down here for now. Moving to the back of the case, we're going to grab these extra wires and figure out how to connect them. Now in this bundle we have this cable, which is USB 3 for the top headers, and then we have a bunch of cables for other things. So here with these guys that are separated, we have our power switch, power reset, and these are all labeled our LEDs, hard drive LEDs, and then we have our audio headers for the front, and then this is USB 2.0. And on this case we have cutouts in here that you're going to be able to pass these cables through. So on the other side, when I go to connect them, I'm just going to pass them up through here, whichever hole is the closest to the motherboard, and I'm going to connect them. This is going to be another one of those things that are really hard to see because my hands block it, but our HD audio is right over here in this corner, and everything is labeled on the motherboard. We have our regular USBs here, we have our USB Type-C there, and then this is all the system connectors. So for the power button, the reset switch, the LED lights, and on page 23 of the manual, it actually says exactly where each little thing goes, and along with that we have little labels. So I'm going to grab each cable, make sure my orientation is correct, and then go ahead and plug it in. On the HD audio, you'll notice that there's one pin missing on the connector, and that's how you align it, where there's one little pin missing. Now this case comes with a fan controller, and it has these 3 different cables coming out of it. This is going to be for power that we're going to need to plug in, and this is going to get plugged into the motherboard. That way we can control it through software. And this one that's labeled extension cable, you can plug another fan into this. So this is good if you have like an air cooler. Since we're using a liquid cooler that has a bunch of extra fans and a pump, I'm not going to use this connection for it. So I'm going to ignore the one that says extension cable. We're going to route this through, plug it into the motherboard, and this will be connected to the power supply. The next step is going to be removing this top portion right here so that we can install our radiator and our water cooling system. So in each one of these 4 corners on this side and over here, there's a little plastic tab that you just have to squeeze together and push up on. So if you look up there, you'll see it. And then now you'll be able to see where our radiator will be mounted. We're gonna attach the fans to the bottom of the radiator here, so it's gonna pull in air from the inside of the case, push it through the radiator, and the hot air will come out from the top of the case. And so the side that doesn't have fans is gonna attach to the top. So like I showed, the Enermax logo's the right way up here, but on the fans themselves, when you attach these, and you want to make sure that this end with the motor and the wires actually is going to attach to the radiator itself. Now these fans line up just like this, right where you see the holes on the radiator. You want to make sure you see the Enermax logo here, so you have these fans oriented the right way. And we're going to be using these long screws that pass all the way through the fan and into the radiator. Now that our fans are attached, we're going to grab this cable that was included with the hardware, and what this does is that connects all 3 of these fans together and allows us to connect them to the motherboard with just one connection and control it with just one connection in software. Before we install the radiator to the case, we're going to grab these little screws that are in the hardware, and we're going to go ahead and screw them into the mounts like that. And you want to make sure that you're careful not to touch the top of the CPU once again. And now I'm going to grab the remaining screws and just carefully align our radiator to the top of the case. And it actually looks like we're going to have to remove this rear fan here because it's in the way, since I am using the largest radiator that this case supports. So the radiator is only going to line one way. It's going to be closer to the camera, to the side of the case over here. And then I'm going to grab these excess, I don't know if you can see them, but these excess little cables that we have, and I'm going to kind of just force them into the extra space that we have on top of here. I'm going to move the radiator as close as I can to the front to allow more room for that fan. I'm going to thread a few of these down, that way I don't have to support and hold the radiator while I try screwing them in. And then of course, tighten down the radiator to the case and make sure not to over tighten it. Now let's raise up this little fan and screw it back in where it was. And I'm going to make 2 lines going horizontal across the Ryzen CPU. Usually I just do 1, and maybe let's do a 3rd one over here. So they basically give you just enough to get the job done. So that thermal paste application looks quite ugly, but they give you just enough to get it done. And typically I just put like a circle in the middle, but with how large this die is, I ended up doing 3 lines like that. And now I'm going to open up and take off the sticker. Make sure you don't touch the copper there. And carefully flip this around. And this is going to sit down right on top of those little mounting screws that we attached. And what I like to do is once I set this down, I try not having it move around too much because you don't want it to unevenly squish out that thermal paste. And then we want to grab our little screws like this that have springs in them and tighten them down. And you just want to basically hand tighten it at first. You don't want to screw it down all the way right away, because it's going to apply uneven pressure on the CPU and squeeze out that thermal paste off to one side. There you go. As soon as I feel the pressure that I can't go anymore, that's where I stop. Now the next thing we're going to do is plug in our fans that are all tied into one connection, and then the water pump. So the water pump cable comes right out of the actual pump itself. And this guy is going to be plugged in right up here. It's very difficult for you guys to see, but it's right between this little plastic piece and this aluminum piece, right below the 4-pin power adapter. Okay, so I connected it right there, as you guys see, and now I'm just going to push this cable up and get it out of the way and kind of hide it into that little section behind the radiator. There we go. And then now on this side is the cable for the fan, so I pushed everything right behind the radiator. And then this one's going to go right above this 8-pin power connector on the right-hand side. This one's a 4-pin, and you can actually look from behind and above the case, and you can clearly see where it plugs in. So right up there. Now we can move on to our RAM. We have 4 slots here and 4 slots here, and I have 8 sticks equaling a total of 64. If you have 4 sticks giving you 32, that's totally fine. For a lot of people, probably most people, that is enough. Now the way these work is these right here, these don't open up, but the top ones, they're little push pins or push clips. You just push up on it, and as you can see on the RAM, we have a little notch, and it looks like it's in the center, but it's actually not. And this just makes sure that you only put it in one way. So I like to align the bottom and then align the top and apply some force first at the bottom and then at the top, and you'll actually hear a little click when it clicks in. As you can see, all of the logos face one direction, and on the other side it actually flips and the notch is higher up here. So we want to flip it the other way, and same thing, just apply even pressure. I also want to mention that if you're not using 8 sticks of RAM, if you're only using 4 or 2, you want to check the manual for the best configuration, which slots you want to use for the maximum performance. Now, with this motherboard, it's on page 20 of the manual, at least mine, and it says if you're using 4, you want to use slot 1, slot 3, and then slot 5 and slot 7. So go ahead and check your manual. If you have a different motherboard, make sure you're plugging it in correctly. Now we're also going to be installing the graphics card now, and same thing with the graphics card. We have 4 slots with this motherboard, but only 2 of them support the full 16x speeds, and we're just using one graphics card. We want to make sure we plug it into one of those slots. Now for this motherboard specifically, our first slot and our third slot are the full speed 16x, and these 2 middle ones being 8x. The motherboard says that if you're using just one graphics card and we want to use this top one, in the past I've tested and there really isn't a difference if you have another 16x slot, so you could do it here, but if we connect our card to the top one, we're going to have more airflow down here for the card to be able to use. So let's start out by removing these top 2 PCI covers. So you just need a screwdriver. And then now over here we have a little tab. We want to unlock this before inserting our graphics card. And I'm going to take off the little cover there. And like with everything, we just want to be careful. These little tabs right here, those actually lock in right behind the motherboard. So we want to align our graphics card to the open slots in the back, line up the little connector, and gently push in. Don't try to force it. And you'll actually hear and see the little locking tab lock as soon as it's pushed in all the way. Sometimes you need to kind of hold the graphics card up a bit. That way you can get the screw lined up. And then now we can grab our last power cable that plugs into the graphics card, and we can also route it through one of these slots. I'm going to route mine through probably the same slot as our 24 pin, since it's going to line up well with the graphics card. And then here we see an 8-pin connector and a 6-pin connector for our graphics card. Usually you have these little additional, you have a 6-pin with this little additional little 2-pin that you can add on, lock it in place. And this one's easier, it's just a 6-pin. There we go. So we're practically done with this build other than putting our covers back on, but I do want to mention if you're going to be installing a 3.5-inch hard drive or a 2.5-inch hard drive or SSD, you're going to need to get an additional power connector for your power supply. It should come in the box. It's flat and long. It's labeled SATA. Or if you have one that's not modular, it's just going to be there already. And then you also need a little SATA cable. You get these included with the motherboard, and they plug in right on the back of the hard drives, the exact same connection. You can only put it in one way. Now, I'm not going to be installing a hard drive in here other than the NVMe SSD. I edit my media externally on SSDs or on the RAID, so I don't really need that. If you're going to be editing internally, I would just suggest getting a larger standard SSD or getting 2 of them that just plug into the motherboard. They're faster and it's so much easier to install it. But if you do need one of these drives, you're going to want to plug in power. This cable plugs into the backside of the hard drive. And over here at the bottom right hand side, we have a bunch of ports that also connect to the other end of the SATA cable facing that direction. And if you're going to install a 2.5-inch hard drive, the 2 mounting points are right here. So you just unscrew this little bracket. It screws into the bottom of the smaller drives. Make sure your connections are facing towards the back, and then that's when you plug in the SATA power into your SATA cable. Or if you're doing the larger hard drives, I'll show you guys right here. That screws into these little drive cages, just like when we removed this hardware box. You undo the thumb screws, pull it out, mount it to the bottom, make sure your connections are facing this way, and then plug in your SATA cable and your power cable, and then of course the other end of the SATA cable plugs into the motherboard. So very easy to do, so you guys will be able to do that if you need it. But like I said, if you're going to edit off of drives, I just recommend getting larger NVMe hard drive that plugs into the motherboard, because they're faster and they're very inexpensive nowadays. Now we can go ahead and grab our top cover. You just want to align these little points that pop in, these little clips, and then align your USB ports and your audio ports at the top, and then just gently push down. And then on the back side of the case, you can get some zip ties and grab these cables, zip tie them together. There's different little mounting points that you can attach. I don't have too much cables here, and they actually hide over here since it's all covered in the front. So I'm not going to do that. And then you want to grab your little back panel. We are now ready for our power cable. You can also plug in your monitor if you want to, but I'm just going to plug this in. So I connected my monitor, keyboard, and mouse, and I screwed in the two little antennas to the back into the little Wi-Fi ports. I really like when motherboards have built-in Wi-Fi. And I also have a USB drive formatted to FAT32, and I downloaded the latest motherboard BIOS from ASRock's website. So I'm going to have a link to that product page, and it shows you exactly how to do it. So we're going to grab our USB, plug it into this port right here, which has the silver or the gray box around it, and then with the power turned on, I'm going to press and hold down on that BIOS button right there. Okay, it's going to flash. And then as soon as it stops flashing, that means the BIOS has been updated. There we go. Now for this board, at least with my software, online it asks to download and install one BIOS and then do the latest one because they had some probably major changes. So I'm going to pull this out, shut it down, pull this out, and do this again with the latest one. That silver USB drive was a 32 gig USB 3, and I tried so many things to get it to flash, but it wouldn't work. When I would turn it on, it would actually flash a few times and then it would get stuck on green, which means it's not working. So this is a USB 2.0 16 gig formatted to FAT32. I downloaded the BIOS and put it on the drive, and then I changed the name, and the instructions are on page 29 of your manual along with the website. And I actually had to do this twice. First to get it from 2.0 to, I believe, 2.3, and then from 3.3 or 2.3 to the newest version. It kind of depends on which one you have, and you can find that out underneath the graphics card. There's a little sticker. Mine said P2.00, and so I need to go to 2.3 and then to the latest version. So I did it once already. I'll show you the second time around. All we do is take this little USB drive, and I would suggest a USB 2.0 if it's not working. Plug it in. We want to make sure we have power to the computer, but we don't need to turn it on. Press and hold the BIOS button for about 3 seconds, and then we should just get it. It should just keep flashing. If it stops and it's a solid color, that means it's not working. That's what I was getting previously. So now it's flashing, and it should take a couple minutes, and then it's gonna completely go black without any light illuminated, and that means we are done. So right underneath our graphics card is the sticker that tells us the firmware that is installed. So I'm starting out with P2.00, and I need to update it to be able to use Threadripper. So now is the moment of truth. Now before I install that BIOS update, it would just turn on, stay on for like 5 seconds, and then restart. Hopefully now everything is going to be good. And if you bought a newer motherboard, or your motherboard version is newer than this one, I think with this motherboard, 3.2 is the BIOS version that supports this, this brand new 32 core CPU, then you might be fine without doing that. So let's go ahead, turn this on. It looks like we're good. I got scared for a second. It's always very nervous to get that. So turned on, turned off, and then automatically turned back on. There we go. We have our logo. Hopefully we're going to boot into the BIOS right now. There we go. I'm in the BIOS now. It actually kept resetting the system, restarting. It would show the ASRock logo, but it wouldn't go anywhere because we don't have any software installed. And I had to hit F2 repeatedly once it was booting to get into this actual BIOS. And I'm going to bring you guys in a little closer. As you guys can see here, I have version 3.30. I started at 2.0, then upgraded it to 2.3, which is the bridge. That's all listed on site, and then to 3.3. We have our W2990WX32 core processor, so that is great. Here on the RAM, we are seeing an issue. So I actually have, it's showing 50 gigs of RAM instead of 64. So it's actually not seeing any RAM in slot D1 and D2. If we open up our manual to page 20, we'll see that D1 is the second slot and D2 is the first slot. So for some reason, we are not reading correctly over there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit exit over here, discard changes and exit. And then I'm going to flip the power switch here, hit this power button actually, flip the switch. And now let's try to reseat these. Make sure I apply even force, that's in all the way. So I'm booting up the system again. I'm going to go ahead and enter the BIOS, and I actually played around with my RAM multiple times, swapped slots, and it looks like I actually got 2 bad RAM sticks because no matter how I install them in here, wherever I put them, it just shows that it doesn't show up, unfortunately. And I've built, I don't even know how many systems, so many systems over these years, and I think I've only had 1 bad stick of RAM other than this time. So this most likely won't happen to you, 99.9%. If it does, you can swap out the RAM, and most RAM comes with a lifetime warranty anyways. So I'm gonna have to get some other RAM instead of this, but the system is still gonna work just fine. Let's go ahead and turn it on. I'm gonna hit F2. And let's take a quick look inside of our actual BIOS here. So I just set up 32 gigs of RAM right now. For most people, 32 gigs of RAM is enough. And unless you're doing super long projects or having a bunch of programs opened up at the same time, that's not really going to be a limitation or a slowdown for you. So here we have our processor showing up. I'm going to go over to the OC tweaker setting here. And I'm not going to be covering overclocking. You can look that up online. There's a lot of information about it. But what I did do is I went into this profile for the RAM. And I'm going to go in here. I'm going to set this to 3000, which is the speed of my memory. You just want to make sure it's running at least at the speed that your RAM comes with and what it's rated for. I'm going to go over to our hardware monitor, and I just want to make sure everything's working right. So here we have our temperatures for our CPU. We have fan number 1. This is going to be the pump, and then chassis fan 3. Those are our fans for the radiator. So I'm going to make sure the temps look normal. This is a little bit high, but a lot of times the Threadripper and Ryzen's read really high too. Plus we have 32 cores here. So now we're ready to install Windows. This is a little thumb drive that I downloaded Windows 10 off of Microsoft website onto. So they actually have a little tool that will format the drive and install everything on there. Very easy to do. I'll leave a link in that video description. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug it in to one of my USB ports. I'll do the top one over here. And what our system should do is once we reboot it, it should actually automatically boot from that. So I'm going to hit Save Changes. If the USB doesn't automatically boot into Windows, you can hit F11. But it looks like it's probably grabbing it. There we go. So it did end up booting from there. And now we just have our typical Windows 10 setup. If you've never went through it, it's very easy. Just follow the steps, hit Install. And if you don't have a serial key, if you just downloaded it online, you can skip and say, I don't have one yet. And it'll still allow you to install the full version. You'll just get a little annoying watermark. So right here, I'm gonna hit I don't have a product key. If you do, obviously enter it. So unfortunately, my microphone was off, but as soon as you plug in that USB drive, it's gonna notice and find Windows and start up the installation for you. If it doesn't, you could just hit F11 and then it'll give you the options of what to boot from. So you select your USB. And if you've never done a Windows setup, it's super easy, step by step. It's gonna ask you what your SSD is. You select it, hit New for the partition, and just click Next from then on. Enter your serial key if you have one. If you don't, hit I don't have one. And that's it. It's going to set up Windows for you, and that's basically all you have to do from then on. I would suggest going to your graphics card manufacturer, downloading the latest drivers. any other software you need, like Adobe Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve. Do all your Windows updates, antivirus if you use it, and that is all, guys. So hopefully this video has helped you out a lot, especially for those of you guys who are first-time computer builders. I know it definitely helps to see everything step by step, how you piece things together, how you do the BIOS updates, and to get to this state just like you would have bought this at the store, except for you get the exact components you want, higher quality components. You're not wasting money on certain things that you don't need. And yep, that's it. So I have links in the video description to all of these parts that I used, the suggestions that I would use if I buy something a little bit different, and as well as the website for the BIOS update and to create the Windows USB. If you guys have any questions, ask in the comment section below. This has been Max. Make sure you guys are subscribed. You guys have those notifications enabled, and I will see you in the next video.